Gerard Lyons, I suppose the big question here is there any way that tax could be cut that wouldn't make the inflation crisis worse?
Well, absolutely. I think timely, targeted and fully costed tax cuts are necessary, and they would not be inflationary. But to understand that, I think it's important to appreciate what is driving inflation at the moment. If inflation was driven by an economy that was overheating because the domestic demand was so buoyant and people were spending like there's no tomorrow, then that would imply that tax cuts would not be appropriate. But our inflation is caused by two different areas. It's caused by supply side problems, and it's been caused by lax monetary policy, particularly last year. So in this environment, it's necessary to have tighter monetary policy to get inflation under control. But at the same time, there's scope to use fiscal policy to address the other problem the economy faces, which is weakening domestic demand. So in answer to your question, it's because the economy faces two conflicting problems, higher inflation and weaker domestic demand. And because that inflation is not caused by domestic economic overheating, it's possible to have tax cuts that are appropriate if targeted properly, and they need not be inflationary.
Is it your view, then, that when Liz Truss says that her £30 billion or thereabouts in tax cuts, when she says that that fits within the fiscal headroom of the Exchequer, and we know that there's more fiscal headroom because of inflation, I suppose, in the first place, is she right?
Yeah, well, I haven't seen the full details of her plans, but in general terms, the answer would be yes. The reality is that there was fiscal space back in the spring, in times of the spring statement. Economists then said there was probably 20 to 30 billion pounds of fiscal space, money that was not used that could have been. Now, in the first 3 months of this fiscal year, from April, May, June, we've seen that government tax revenues up by close to 15 billion pounds more than was the case last year, because higher inflation is allowing tax revenues to pick up. Now, admittedly, at the same time, government spending in real terms is also being squeezed. So there is scope for more government spending, but there's also scope for tax cuts, and it's where you get the balance right. But in answer to your question, tax cuts are affordable, and indeed there might well be more than 30 billion of fiscal space available, but some of that additional money will have to be allocated to spending, to bring spending budgets up in real terms. And probably pretty close to 30 billion might be available for tax cuts. But it's important to stress that those tax cuts need to be properly targeted.